So I was watching the flicks, coming up with several ways of interpreting both those scenes. And what I would share is the following, and it's in part I'm influencing. I spoke to Jennifer walking in here. She's a psychology major. And I think with those films, at least a segment of those films, I can interpret the following. Years ago, I was at a executive seminar over at UCLA put on by YPO. And as a side note, I will say, as a leader, reaching outside and having experiences outside of your own organization, I think from manager on up, is absolutely critical, not to fall into what I call the ivory tower syndrome of drinking your own Kool-Aid. And going to one of these seminars, the gentleman speaking was Michael Milkins, who most of you know, he was the founder of what we call today high yield bonds. It was called in its day junk bonds. But basically he created a market onto his own. I say he's one of the true visionaries of his day. And among the statements he made, because he talked very little about per se business in the dollars and cents, he talked at the time, this goes back about 18 years ago, what felt very abstract, which was human capital. And his prediction was that, in particular in this country, we'll never be able to outcompete the up-and-coming developed countries from a manufacturing and kind of what I'd call the grunt of working more hours and studying more hours. He went on to say that the most important thing about today's world, and in particular the work world, is human capital, and understanding human capital and knowing how to work it. So my leadership experience is this: I am your quintessential entrepreneur. I've started businesses. I thrive on chaos. It's very much my familiar. But what I learned along the way, and I can only share this with you as being 52 and looking back at my body of experiences to describe the following. That very much in going through those stages of being an entrepreneur, at some point my strengths became my weaknesses. And what does that mean? In a simple term was, I had an organization that was about $35 million. We thrived on chaos, and much like he shows in Gladiator, you know, on one hand, at least especially back in those days, it was a very chaotic way. You all charged in, it was mass chaos. But if you look at Russell Crowe, there's a certain discipline he has as a leader and a certain connection he has with his people. And underneath that, my interpretation of seeing that clip, he's gonna beat his opponents because he has a sense of organization about him. So where I'm going with this is, when I went to make this transition, because I was wanting to become this $100 million a year company, I brought in an outside consultant who went on to tell me, "You'll never get there, Paul. You're in massive denial." I said, "Okay." I said, "Explain." And basically what he went on to say is, unless I changed my ways, which was a very hard concept because it's the very thing that got me to where I was my strengths. And he said, unless you change your ways, you will not succeed any further. And what he was talking about was a different type of leadership. And the leadership he was talking about was getting out of the day-to-day chaotic sense, which I think most small businesses thrive on, and going somewhere towards a more organized structure. Well, that sounds great, but how do you do it? And essentially what I did is I brought in what I call an industrial psychologist who sat around and, for the most part, in simplest words, psychoanalyzed our key managers. And what I found was that certain people, and I'll say about 50% of my employees on the management level, were able to look at introspectively, look at who they were, understand their strength, their weakness, and then, most importantly, be willing to change. The other half of my senior management team simply was not willing to change. Whether they themselves were in denial, whether they hit their comfort level, which the beauty most of you have in this room being young, you don't yet know what your rigid points are, and in theory you're a lot more flexible. But what it came down to is people's willingness to change and adapt. And I think in today's world, that is more relevant than other, because your generation will have 3, 4, 5 careers. And my general sense or statement would be, as a leader, it's a leader who is willing to identify his strengths, identify his weakness, look at where his strengths are becoming his weakness, and be willing to change. So the transformation, and it wasn't until after I made the transformation of getting out of this chaos of the way smaller companies thrive to going someplace more to a place of organization. And then the backdrop to that is that in order to get there, the people who decided to go with me, meaning the 50% who stayed with the company, had to absolutely believe in what I was telling them, meaning I had to live it myself. Now the post note to that was, when I got to 100 million, what I realized, that wasn't what I was passionate about. I wasn't an operational person. I did it, I understood how to get there, but in the end, I sold that business to go back to what I really like doing, which is the smaller, entrepreneurial, frankly, the more kind of chaotic environment, because there I think each one of you starting out your career will find out whether you have a temperament for a more nuanced kind of sense of organization, or whether you prefer this environment being more spontaneous and kind of every day's a little different than the next. So hopefully that makes sense.